get that started. So I am Sara Bronin. I am the founder of Desegregate Connecticut. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody here today for our topic, how has zoning reform worked in other states? This is a constant question we are asked. We have brought in a number of speakers from other jurisdictions through the course of our 18 months of events, and we're so excited about the panelists that we have here today who are going to illuminate perspectives from 3 states, including 1 neighboring state. So we're very excited about that. As you know, next slide, please. We are a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits. We are pro-homes. That means we are for building more housing, especially given Connecticut's crunch affordable housing shortage, or really housing shortage in general, something that we've seen in the market and we all recognize. We really are focused the last year and this year on zoning laws. We really think that zoning laws can lead to some problems that can be addressed through reform at the local and statewide levels. Our coalition includes 81 different members. We're really proud of that. They represent a cross-section of civic and cultural life in Connecticut, everybody from environmental organizations to arts organizations, safe streets groups, and of course, those who are most involved in land use and planning issues, including our planners and architects and others. So just a quick note before we get into the presentation about what has happened here in Connecticut for those of you who are joining from other states or just need a quick primer. Last year, we passed Public Act 2129 here. There were a few things in the next slide that we can highlight, but you can find on our website, which hopefully someone will post to the chat, better descriptions of all of this, but just a few things that are worth highlighting. The first is that the act that was passed last year legalized accessory apartments statewide. Those are small units of housing that are built on the same lot as single family housing. In addition, the legislature became the first or one of the first to cap minimum parking mandates. And parking, we have seen many studies, and we have a website about parking that links to a lot of these. But parking tends to drive up housing prices, and the parking mandates that we have in zoning codes across the country have proven to be both unnecessary and expensive. So our parking reform that happened last year caps what municipalities can impose on housing to 1 unit for studios and 1 space rather for studio and 1 bedroom units, and 2 spaces for 2 bedroom or more units. So we're pretty proud about that. Again, just a highlight, the bill also ensured that commissioners were trained and that zoning enforcement officials were certified, and created a study commission that is actively pursuing a model form-based code for towns to adapt to their own circumstances. So there's a lot more that the bill did in terms of fair housing standards and other things, but that was a really important first step that happened last legislative session. So with that in mind, we are going into this legislative session with 3 key proposals. The first revolves around zoning around transit stations, and predominantly train stations are in that mix, but we've also included the Connecticut fast track stations that are fixed and have platforms that are in the greater Hartford region. In addition, we are advocating for more sensible lot sizes, again, following reforms in other states, one not represented here, Vermont, which also unanimously through their legislature enacted lot size reform. And so we hope to pick up on that and try to make sure that where there is infrastructure, we can build denser housing. And then finally, streamlining bureaucracy, which we find in our 169 towns and 180 zoning jurisdictions has been a pretty big deterrent to housing, and actually has been a source of frustrations for towns. So we are encouraging the collapsing of, at town's option, of commissions, zoning boards and planning and zoning commissions, and also the creation at the town's option of combining forces with another town to help them reduce their administrative costs and to also make sure that they have enough volunteers to staff these commissions which are currently required to be pretty highly staffed, no matter if you're in a small town or a big one. So with that in mind, those couple of points in mind, we want to turn to our panel. And this is a really great panel. I think what I'll do is introduce everybody by name now, and then introduce them more carefully in the over the course of the presentation as they start their comments. So our first speaker is Jon Wizard from California. I'll say a bit about him in a moment. Second is Mary Kyle McCurdy, beaming into us from out in Oregon. And then finally, Jesse Kanson-Benanav, who is beaming in from Massachusetts. So again, I'll provide more detailed introductions as each speaker pulls up their slides. But I'm going to invite Jon to pull up his slides as I say a couple words about him. He is a city council member in Seaside, California. He is a commissioner for the Housing Authority in Monterey, and he is a candidate for the state assembly. We always like to see pro-homes candidates out there. He is also the policy director for YIMBY Law. For those not familiar, that is Yes in My Backyard, an organization that's dedicated to addressing California's housing shortage through legal education and advocacy. And so with that, I'll ask that my video spotlight be given over to Jon, and that he be able to start his remarks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate it. I am a little bit jealous that I don't get to beam in from California, but hopefully the presentation is concise enough to not put you to sleep. For me, it's 9 a.m. So hopefully your lunch hour does not produce a nap during zoning reform in California. The biggest thing we're pushing out here in California that has seemed to get traction and get past the post is accessory dwelling units. And we have lots of fun names for them, particularly here in California with our great cultural richness with our Mexican and Chicano and Latino heritage. We enjoy casitas. We have a casita coalition, as you might have heard of before. And, you know, ADUs are styled as the kind of magic solution, the silver bullet. It's, you know, low density housing. It is already on disturbed lands. It's affordable by design because it's nice and small. And if you aren't renting it out to somebody, you know, you could be an art studio or a yoga studio, or you could put grandma back there, or when your kids come back from college. There's 1,000 reasons why they're great. In terms of a policy framework, though, in California, we had some good work with Henry Mello, a former state senator from this region here on the Monterey Peninsula, Santa Cruz, that sort of pioneered it, but it kind of got stuck over time. And so in the last 4 years or so, we have gotten rid of the floor area ratio penalty. It no longer counts toward your total floor area ratio on your lot. So, you know, if you're only allowed to do 20%, you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you have a 2,000 square foot house, that's your 20% FAR. You can still do an ADU, it doesn't count against your FAR. We reduced setbacks. It used to just be a city's discretion. Now it's 4 feet uniformly, but if you have an existing structure like a carport or a shed or a garage, anything at all that is a legal accessory structure, you can use the footprint of that, and it can be on the lot line. So that has not yet made a lot of people frustrated, but certainly as our less welcoming neighbors want more space between us and them, you know, 1 foot setbacks and 3-inch setbacks can get people a little bit excited. Minimum heights, or I'm sorry, minimum enforceable height limits are 16 feet. If it's a second story, you're allowed 22 feet. Ministerial approval, and you have to, as a city, you have to say yes in a finite amount of time. You know, I think it's 60 or 90, and now that I'm saying it, I can't remember which, but we'll call it 60 days. once your project, we have, very robust environmental laws here in California. And once your project is deemed complete, 61 days goes by and you can build it as submitted, whether or not it would comply with state law because the city didn't hold up their end of the bargain, so to speak. We've gotten rid of replacement parking as long as you're within a mile of a transit stop. Doesn't matter if it's high quality, low quality, bus, train, ferry, as long as there is a public transit option within a mile of you, no replacement parking is required. And now we've got some new cool stuff around separate conveyance. It used to just be, if Habitat for Humanity built your ADU and you wanted to sort of give that to them after some amount of time, Habitat could sell the ADU as separately from your parcel. And now anybody can do that. Some new law that just went into effect January 1st. So we have a lot of laws that are trying to get to how do we actualize these things. And the missing one, the glaring omission here is the money. We've had an assembly member in San Francisco for 3 years now ask the governor to approve a $500 million recycle loan program. You borrow money and you pay it back with the rents that you receive. And it has not passed despite our historic multi-billion-dollar budgets. And so that is still the piece that we're trying to figure out locally and at the state level at this point with our friends in the commercial lending sector. Transit-oriented development is frankly a no-brainer. I mean, I don't know why we would not be building more homes where there is public transit. So you need the ridership to make public transit feasible, and you need public transit to make higher density feasible. So it's really kind of hand in glove. And we tried that with SB 50. Some of you might remember that. And it would have been really phenomenal. Lots of verticality, lots of density to support public transit, which we are seeing with the pandemic, ridership levels sink and feasibility plummet through the floor. So, for 1,000 reasons, this is good stuff. The higher density is always a better use of land. There's less car dependence, which means there's more money in people's pockets, which means they're spending more money in their communities, which means that there's more tax revenue for cities. It's a safer way to live, and it's a healthier way to live. You're getting out of your car because you don't have one, and you're moving your body. You are walking up and down stairs or riding the elevator, but walking across their pedestrian promenade, not playing Frogger, trying to avoid a car or a truck. We really should be maximizing our transit-oriented developments. And there are obvious concerns, who's going to live near the train and what if it's loud? And okay, well, maybe the regional train stop is not underneath somebody's house, but the light rail stop is nearby, because we've all seen and or visited places that have ubiquitous transit and light rail and tram systems. And it seems to be there's plenty of people around. So these sort of fake arguments around quality of life are just that. And it's not showing up on my screen, but the next slide has to do with parking. So okay, that one worked. So parking minima. We had a wonderful bill here in California last year. It was Assembly Bill 1401, AB 1401, and it would have created parking maximums instead of parking minima. And a parking maximum is how we prevent local communities and zoning bodies from exacting taxes on those folks who would be building homes. In the city of Los Angeles, depending on where you are, because it's a big place, the estimate is about $30,000 or so per parking spot. So if you're building 10 homes, you're out $300,000, which is the better part of half of one of those apartments or condos or whatever it may be in construction costs. Or it's the amenities. You're not doing the community garden. You're not doing the higher end finishes. You're not creating the bike facilities and the bike storage and all of those things, because you're paving parking lots. And if you do parking under the structure, now we're getting into more expensive engineering. We're getting into longer construction processes and potentially less sustainable building methods. It's concrete and cement require a lot more energy than wood. So parking creates a lot of extraordinary costs that we don't frankly need. And because it's just the way that we do it now, doesn't mean it's the way that we should keep doing it. Just as a final point, to be a little more specific about the exactions, in California, one of the reasons why AB 1401 died was because a lot of our affordable housing advocates contested that if we got rid of the parking requirement, there would be no leverage for cities to require more affordability provisions. And so I think we have to have conversations, at least here in California, about sort of us eating our own tails, the snake eating its own tail, about if we don't build the thing in the first place, 100% of zero is zero. So what is the virtue of parking minima as value capture only to not get the thing in the first place? So that was it from me. And I appreciate your patience while I walk through some pretty wonky stuff.
Oh, well, we love wonky stuff here, so really appreciate it. And thinking about how California has evolved over the last few years is something that I think is really interesting for our audience as we embark on our more coordinated efforts statewide to get zoning reform over the finish line. So Catherine, if you don't mind sharing the next set of slides. Our next speaker is Mary Kyle Mccurdy. So I heard her speak at a panel a couple of maybe 18 months ago or so at the Furman Center, and her deep knowledge of Oregon's land use reforms and her involvement in that, I think, is going to be really interesting to this audience. She is the deputy director of 1,000 Friends of Oregon, a longtime and nonpartisan group that monitors government agencies to ensure they properly manage land use issues and that pioneers good planning at the state level. So I think she has a lot packed into her presentation too. So I think I'm just going to pass the baton over to her as she describes really several decades of land use reforms in Oregon. Take it away.
And thank you all of you for joining us today. My name again is Mary Kyle Mccurdy, Deputy Director and Staff Attorney at 1,000 Friends of Oregon. And thank you, Catherine, for sharing these slides. If you could go to the next one. Oregon's land use planning program has been in place for almost 50 years now. So we have a lot of base to build on here with housing reform. It started with the passage of Senate Bill 100 in 1973. And the impetus behind that bill was a concern for both the loss of agricultural and forest lands and the concern of what was going on in cities in other parts of the United States with the disinvestment in cities and sprawl. And both of those trends were of concern to Oregon legislators. So Senate Bill 100 passed. It was a bipartisan bill led by a Republican governor, and it created the structure that we have statewide. Next slide, please. We have a state agency and a state commission that oversees and adopts the administrative rules to implement our land use planning program. And among those are these 19 statewide goals. These are the core of the program. You can see them here. I'm certainly not going to go into all of them, but every city and county in Oregon, and those are the only jurisdictions we have to adopt land use plans and zoning regulations that conform to these statewide goals. Each of these goals has language, administrative rules, statutes, subsequent case law history behind them. Today, I'm going to focus on Goal 10, housing. The next slide, please. This is the basic objective of Goal 10, to provide for the housing needs of all Oregonians, including adequate numbers of needed housing units at price ranges and rent levels, which meet the financial needs of Oregon households in location, type, and density. Now, that language was written in 1974. It's still just as good today. And every city in the state, no matter the size, has to provide zoning to meet the needs of all housing types. And of course, that doesn't alone deliver affordability, but if we don't have the land use planning correctly and the zoning correctly, we will not get to affordability. And that means no city is zoned just for single family housing in Oregon. They have multifamily and single family housing. And I would say that the first plan adoptions and regulations were pretty primitive in that way, that there's zones for single family housing and zones for multifamily housing. There wasn't a lot of nuance to that or building on the other tools related to zoning that can help deliver relatively more affordable and diverse housing types. So next slide, how are we doing? Like Connecticut, like many states and various cities across the United States, we're not doing that well. We need to be building about 30,000 more housing units each year to meet not only the growing population from people moving here, but also to make up for the loss in housing that we experienced and others may have experienced, or the slowdown during the recession. We are building about 20,000 new housing units each year, so we are falling farther and farther behind. And we also have this structural mismatch between family size and income and zoning. In Oregon, this is true across the United States, about 2/3 of all households at any time are made up of 1 or 2 persons. Doesn't mean that's how we're all living at any particular time, but at some point in our lives, most of us are. And yet, well over half of all the residential zoning in all of our cities is for detached single family housing, the most expensive and the type that is not meeting really the needs of those who need smaller housing and more affordable housing at different times in their life. We've also seen a failure to fully implement Goal 10, the housing goal at the local level, a failure to fully enforce it at the state level, and a need for technical support and funding. And it's also a reflection of historical residential discrimination and redlining and using exclusively single family zoning to keep in a racially and economically exclusionary way. So this is built up over the years, and our legislature, first in 2017, decided that yes, you can flip to the next slide, Catherine, thank you. That they would, the original bill was more ambitious than just accessory dwelling units, as we call them. But because of all the politics, it resulted in just addressing the accessory dwelling unit issue. So in 2017, our legislature passed Senate Bill 1051. Next slide, please. And it requires every city over 2,500 in population, that captures most of the population of Oregon, to allow an accessory dwelling unit on every single family lot in every residential zone. And they're defined as an interior attached or interior exterior attached or detached residential structure that's accessory to a single family dwelling. And local governments can only adopt reasonable local regulations relating to siting and design. We have a fairly long case history of what's reasonable and what's not reasonable in local residential regulations. And cities cannot require any owner occupancy requirements of the primary or accessory structure. They cannot include additional off-street parking requirements because of the ADU, unless either of those is part of regulating short-term rentals or vacation rentals, as we call them here. There are some places where that is an issue, but in most of the state, it's not. So, and the another element of this law is that it had a deadline for cities to comply. And if they didn't comply, then these were automatically allowed. It was a short deadline. We now have every city in the state has finally complied with this accessory dwelling unit law. And we're really seeing building of ADUs, especially in cities where they've also waived or reduced the permit fee. Thank you. The next slide. But that isn't enough. Clearly, accessory dwelling units are generally left to the homeowner to build, and that's not going to supply all of the different housing needs that Oregonians have. And by 2019, the politics in Oregon and nationwide had really changed, or the understanding that about housing. I think that we all saw across the nation, we've probably all read things like Color of Law. We have been reading about the discriminatory nature of single family housing, and there was just a different environment in the Oregon legislature in 2019 when the middle housing bill passed. And next slide, please. So middle housing under House Bill 2001 is defined as duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, cottage clusters, which you can see defined there, and townhouses. Next slide, please. Every city over 10,000 in Oregon must allow duplexes on all single family lots in residential zones. And there was a deadline of last June for that. Cities over 25,000 in size and all of the cities in the Portland metropolitan area, in addition to duplexes, must also allow all of the other middle housing types that I described somewhere in their single family zones. And again, this came, I think the next slide shows this. Thank you. Right. This legislation also directed our state agency to develop a model code that cities could adopt in part or in whole to comply with the law. And it also adopted minimum standards that the cities must comply with if they wanted to create their own code provisions, including such things as limiting off-street parking, setbacks, requirements for clear and objective design standards. And the theme underlying all of this is that it must be as easy to site middle housing as it is to site single detached housing in a residential zone. These also had deadlines, and the first deadline, as I mentioned, passed last year. Every city that is subject to the duplex requirement has now adopted a code that conforms to that. And the larger cities that must also allow the triplexes and up in their residential zones are required to adopt by the end of June of this year, and several have. We do expect that there will be a few more challenges in some of the cities where this is politically a little bit more challenging, but this has definitely made a big difference and a significant difference. And it's actually been a little bit easier to adopt at the local level than I'd expected. Next slide, please. I think that's it. Thank you. And I am happy to answer any questions. I know that we have tried some of the same things that you heard Jon describe in California to some of the same frustrations in not passing, so such as higher densities near transit and things like that. So when we talk about the tools we need next, I think that'll be interesting to talk about. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary Kyle. And so last, but certainly not least, Jesse, the Executive Director of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. Hopefully you'll be able to share your slides. Abundant Housing is really our local sister organization. It's a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the housing crisis in Massachusetts through organizing and advocacy. Certainly, we're very jealous of your completely bipartisan transit proposal that passed. Maybe the East Coast is having better luck on that front. Hopefully, that'll extend to Connecticut this year. But looking forward to your comments, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I'm glad to bring it back to the East Coast here and participate in this panel from sponsored by our neighbors in Connecticut. It's always good to see Massachusetts Connecticut collaboration. So I'm going to talk about some pretty major zoning reform that we did in Massachusetts last year with a focus specifically on some transit-oriented upzoning requirements that are in the process of being implemented here in Massachusetts. So make sure my slides are, there we go. So Sarah pointed out, we did a bipartisan, pretty major zoning reform last year. It was January 2021, bipartisan in that we have a Republican governor, although the legislature has a super majority Democratic membership, both in the House and Senate. This zoning reform had actually been a priority of Governor Baker. and it was ultimately passed as a part of a broader economic development bill at the end of the previous 2-year legislative cycle. These three elements I'm going to mention quickly had been in previous sessions introduced by legislators as standalone bills or different combinations of these bills, none of which ever passed. But because of the dynamics of the way these economic development bills work in Massachusetts, where they sort of throw the kitchen sink in and legislators don't have enough time to read everything before they vote, but no legislator wants to be the one who voted against an economic development bill, these things all passed and they survived the potential for line item vetoes by the governor. So we refer to this generally as housing choice. This was just sort of the marketing slogan that the governor applied to it, at least the first element here. So what housing choice did in Massachusetts was one of a handful of states that, and it may, some of the other states represented on this call may also have this, I believe, but Massachusetts did require a supermajority vote for implementing and passing zoning changes or special permits. And that was, obviously an exclusionary tool to make it harder to do things like upzoning and improve multifamily development in many communities across Massachusetts. So what this bill did was eliminate the supermajority vote requirement in certain zoning changes and special permits with a focus on those that allow multifamily development, near transit, accessory dwelling units, and a few other areas of which I won't go into in this presentation, but happy to provide more details another time. So that was the first piece. And that was definitely the governor's priority, was eliminating that supermajority for certain upzonings across the state. The second piece of it, which I'll spend most of my presentation talking about, is implementing a requirement for as of right multifamily zoning in all MBTA communities. That's the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority that runs the subway commuter rail system here. So 175 communities are statutorily defined as MBTA communities, and every single one of them will be required to have a multifamily district by right, which I will get into. And then the third element that was passed as part of this bill last year was creating a judicial discretion to apply a $50,000 bond when abutters appeal zoning decisions or zoning variances or special permits in order to try to tamp down on NIMBY bad faith appeals. So I am going to talk primarily about number 2, which we refer to generally as the MBTA Communities Bill. So as I mentioned, this law mandates at least one zoning district of a quote reasonable size. We'll get into what reasonable size means in a moment. And it has to allow multifamily zoning of at least 15 units per acre. The zoning has to be as of right. So no, although there's a site plan review allowed, it's essentially, as I think Jon mentioned in his presentation, so ministerial approval. These have to be located within half mile of transit, and the developments or the zoning has to allow developments that are suitable for families with children and without any age restrictions. So as I mentioned, this applies to every community except for the city of Boston. So it's 174 communities around Boston and throughout Eastern Massachusetts, going probably as far west, I guess, as like Worcester and other areas. Consequences for non-compliance, if communities don't adopt zoning that complies with this law, they're ineligible for certain state infrastructure funds. MassWork, which is the largest state infrastructure grant to municipalities to do things like major roadway reconstruction, sewer repairs and replacements, and a variety of other infrastructure needs. So you're ineligible for MassWorks and another smaller infrastructure grant, as well as for the Housing Choice Funds, which is a housing planning grant that the Baker administration implemented a few years ago. You're not eligible for any of these grants if you don't comply. The law in and of itself, left the definition of reasonable size to be determined later. in a guidelines writing process by the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. Interestingly, under Massachusetts law, guidelines are they don't have the full force of law necessarily as full regulations, but they're also easier to modify in case they're not strong enough. So in implementing, and I'm not going to get into all of the guidelines, but the Massachusetts DHCD did release the guidelines in late December. And so the advocates, planners, municipalities, everyone has been digesting them over the last month or so. I'm not going to get into necessarily all of them or everything that they detail, because it's a lot more than I can fit into this presentation, but I'm going to get some of the high level stuff that's interesting. So as I mentioned, the law used the term reasonable size for these districts, but it didn't define reasonable size. So what DHCD has said is that these districts have to be at least 50 acres with that minimum gross density of 15 units per acre. And they have to accommodate that a sort of, well, so let me start with that. Number one, 50 acres minimum with gross density of 15 units per acre means that within these districts, you can allow a variety of housing types. So you can have large multifamily buildings down to like maybe duplexes or 3-deckers, but the gross density across the entire district has to be a minimum of 15 units per acre, which is substantial in a lot of the suburban communities that are impacted by this. And then the second piece of reasonable size is this concept of zoning or zoned capacity. You have to zone for a capacity of new homes based on the type of transit service you have in your community and a percentage of the existing number of units in your community. So if you are a rapid transit community with subway or light rail, think Brookline or Newton or Cambridge or places like that, mostly in the urban core, you have to, in your new district, zone for an additional 25% of your existing housing stock in that community, and then goes down based on transit service. I will say this last category here of adjacent community, there are a number of communities defined statutorily as MBTA communities that don't actually have any MBTA service, but are adjacent to a town that has generally a commuter rail station, sometimes bus service as well. In these cases, you have to zone for at least 10% of your existing housing stock, or a minimum of 750 new units. So that's complicated. Happy to explain it a little bit more if questions come up, if I wasn't clear enough. But this is DHCD's attempt to define that undefined reasonable size criteria in the law. And just to show you how they've defined based on transit service, of course, subway, light rail, mostly in the Boston urban core. And then as you go out, you see some of those adjacent communities that don't actually have any service, but still have to zone for multifamily housing. And this is what it looks like in practice. So Somerville, right next to Boston and Cambridge, has 36,000 units currently in the city. They have subway and light rail. The MBTA Green Line will be extended there starting in March. So they have to zone to allow 25% of that existing housing stock. So they have to zone for 9,000 more units. Then you go down the list, Belmont being a bus-only community, Concord has commuter rail, and then you see a couple of those adjacent communities. Again, your zoned capacity goal is based on a percentage of your current housing stock. So just to sort of bring it all together here, like I said, we are, as the advocates, the planning community, municipalities, everyone's really trying to digest what these mean in practice. And it's really hard because it's hard to know what guidelines on paper are going to mean in practice. But there are some real positive elements coming out of both this law and the guidelines that DHCD has released, which are, should be clear, currently still in draft form. It's an ambitious target. It's requiring that very exclusive suburban communities that have not built much housing, that are 95% white, but do have transit access, have to build more of a variety of housing types in their community to help, economically, racially, ethnically diversify. So it sets very ambitious targets for these all 174 communities impacted. And the fact that it's as of right is important, because it means they can't use special permits or variances or things to make it hard to actually build the type of multifamily housing that this law requires. These guidelines, although they are complex, they set a very clear framework that municipalities can already begin using to implement this zoning. Massachusetts, like other communities in New England, has in a lot of places town meeting form of government, which you could have in some cases every registered voter show up and creates the legislative body for that town. So it's incredibly difficult to go through that process and get zoning changes passed. Well, here are some, it's a very clear framework that towns have to work towards. And it works well in addition to and on top of some existing innovative zoning and affordable housing laws. We have Massachusetts 40B law, which allows affordable housing development to essentially override local zoning, as well as 40R, our smart growth zoning law, can be sort of laid on top of this law. But there are challenges that we're discovering as we work through these draft guidelines. As I mentioned, the law, it doesn't explicitly mandate compliance. As I mentioned, the only thing that happens if you don't comply is that you don't get certain infrastructure and housing funds. Well, we've already heard a variety of communities of city councilors, selectmen, zoning boards talking about, do we actually need these infrastructure funds? Maybe we can forego them and not have to zone for multifamily in our community. So the hook there might not be strong enough. Additionally, DHCD has made it very clear this is not a housing production program. These are not housing production goals. This is just creating a goal for your zoned capacity. And even that alone doesn't mean you'll actually get development out of them. And then a couple other items here. I think I may be going
Jesse,
a little bit long. Yes.
Yeah, Jesse, if you don't mind, we're getting some questions in the chat for you and for others.
Yeah.
But if you had just one more thing to wrap up, I do want to get to the questions so that we can, because I think there's some Connecticut specific applications of what you're talking about, and I don't want to run out of time.
No, totally. I'll just real quickly, these last three things. This isn't an affordable housing program. This is mandating multifamily zoning. So questions about how do you make sure that there's truly affordable, subsidized tax credit development also built. Transit, located near transit doesn't necessarily mean oriented towards that transit. So how do we make sure that it's actually playing off of access to transit? And then make sure that this is an easy thing for municipalities to comply with, because it's not that simple on paper. Here's just some links, the guidelines, and a great explainer by one of our think tanks, the Boston Indicators. Yes, I think that's all I have. Happy to move to questions. Sorry for taking too long.
Oh, no, not at all. It's all the details they're gory, but they're necessary. So before we get off of your topic, and I have a couple of broad questions as well for the whole panel. We have a question from Marty, who's with Liberty Bank, and he asks, in particular on the MBTA communities and opportunity zones, is there a lot of overlap with the opportunity zones, and is there incentives that the state has been taking advantage of to kind of spur on this multifamily development?
That's a really interesting question. And no, there hasn't really, I have not heard any discussion about overlaying this with opportunity zones. And that's maybe a real interesting area for exploration. But the answer is no. at this point.
Thank you. So I'm going to put it back to the whole panel. It looks like everybody's back on Spotlighted. So this has been just great to hear how all three states have worked on these issues. I'm going to ask a general question, and maybe Mary Kyle, you can start with this one. But this is another question from the audience from Patricia Hauser, who asked, to what extent are affordability and density measures linked to increased attention to urban parks, green infrastructure, and I would say environmental issues? Maybe a broader way to put that is, are the kinds of reforms that you're talking about compatible with the environment? Do they keep those, are those two values compatible or not? And I think you've thought a lot about that out in Oregon, so I'll let you start and maybe one of the others can chime in too.
Thank you. There's sort of a big picture answer and a smaller picture answer. On the big picture, those 19 statewide goals that I showed for cities, every city in Oregon of any size has an urban growth boundary containing up to a 20-year land supply for all uses, including green spaces, parks, et cetera. So that planning for natural areas, parks, recreation areas is part of every city's obligation. And those are incorporated into the land use plans. And there's, on the smaller level, there's really recognition and I think a growing exploration of that parks and recreation and trees are not just aesthetic, but they are a key central part of dealing with heat islands and climate change, and integrating those higher densities and affordability into planning, increasing planning for those, and recognizing that to the degree that we are limiting and reducing off-street parking, that we are by increasing more compact urban areas and also compact housing individually, we are decreasing impervious surface. And there's a whole part of this that connects to our transportation planning and the real need to start planning for people and not just for cars and not just impervious surface for cars. So this is all integrated in Oregon. I feel like there was an affordability question in there too, but I'm not sure if I answered that.
I think that referred to the kinds of reform, the zoning reforms themselves, which I think are generally intended to affect affordability.
A part of that House Bill 2001, just to mention, is our state agency adopted housing production strategies, which every city is supposed to adopt, every city over 10,000 in size is supposed to adopt to meet affordability requirements. And I encourage everyone to look at those. I'll put them in the chat if I have a chance to here, or send them to Sara, which is a broad array of financial, zoning, and other strategies to really increase affordability for any kind of housing, but also some particular measures related to subsidized affordable housing.
Great. John or Jesse, did you have anything to add to that question?
I'll just say quickly that in California, an unfunded mandate we have is stormwater control. And so as cities continue to hemorrhage the little money they have, when our friends in the development community decide they'd like to build something and we can create more dense projects that have a greater physical footprint that requires those infrastructure upgrades, they actually help pay for a thing the cities can't afford to do in the first place, which has follow-on environmental benefits and can lead to things like stormwater capture for later advanced water treatment and recycling for reconsumption, when otherwise that water would just carry motor oil out into the ocean.
Great, thank you. And just for Connecticut audience members, Desegregate Connecticut will be releasing, hopefully in the next week or two, an environmental brief that focuses on the intersection between our proposals and environmental issues, and really zoning reform generally that increases density. So with that, I have another question for Jesse, and that is particularly about the Springfield Holyoke area, which is similar in nature to, I would probably say, the Hartford region, maybe a couple other places here. We don't have a Boston in Connecticut, so that may be a more analogous area. Are there similar issues affecting multifamily housing in that area? And how has the state tried to address those?
Yeah, I mean, we have a statewide housing crisis. The crisis looks differently in different regions. The population growth in the Springfield Holyoke area isn't maybe on the level of the Boston region, but they are struggling with increasing prices, particularly as folks have been moving west to escape the high cost of housing in the Boston region. And one of the big conversations is about excuse me, building a high-speed rail connection between Springfield and Boston so that it's easier for folks to live in. There's not as many jobs in the Springfield area, and so that's why population is sort of concentrated towards Eastern Massachusetts, population growth. But that the western portion of the state can grow a bit, and people can avail themselves of slightly more affordable housing with a high-speed rail system that allows them to still work in Boston but live in Springfield, Holyoke. I will add also that there is a bill in Massachusetts House, bill number 1448, and in the Senate, bill 871, which is a priority of abundant housing this year, which would actually expand this MBTA communities rule to the rest of the state. So areas like Springfield and Holyoke that don't have MBTA service, but have service from regional transit authorities, and essentially require them to have multifamily zoning by right as well, with some additional requirements for affordable housing as well, which this law didn't address that I mentioned. So that we just found out got a favorable report from the committee's housing committee yesterday. So that's going to be eligible for a full floor vote, which we'll be pushing for this session. So yeah, it's an attempt to try to bring some of the framework for this MBTA communities upzoning to the rest of the state and recognize there are housing needs and needs for a variety of housing types to make every community across the state more open and accessible to everyone.
Thank you. And just for our Connecticut friends on the call, our proposal for transit-oriented communities this session would include a 10% affordability requirement, deed restricted affordability. So we think that was an opportunity that it sounds like you guys are hopefully picking up in Massachusetts, and creating this kind of housing really should be equitable and not just relying on the market to do that. Okay, we have a few more questions, one from Jeff Perlman, and this is really about how we can integrate housing into transportation planning. So we're taking a different tack from the kinds of proposals that have already been discussed. Maybe again, Mary Kyle, I know with Oregon's comprehensive planning regime, you might have a magic sauce out there that has started to integrate that into transportation. And I might add too, if I could, to the question, sewer and water infrastructure planning that supports middle housing of the kind you showed, and other types of multifamily housing. So have you guys done this? And if so, what has worked well?
The structure of our land use planning program allows for that, but let me make a large caveat. The land use planning program plans. It doesn't have any funding. Local governments, state governments have the funding, but the planning is not as tied to funding as it is in some other regions and states. So the land use planning program required some of those other goals are about transportation planning and public facilities planning. So every city and county has to integrate that land use planning with infrastructure planning. But of course, that doesn't mean the infrastructure gets built or paid for, et cetera. And there's always a chicken and the egg, which is going first, which is catching up with what. And I think over the last several decades, we are doing better at integrating land use and transportation planning. And we are now in the midst of doing that right now in the 8 MPO areas, that 8 major urban areas of Oregon are engaged at the state level with what is called climate-friendly and equitable communities planning, integrating land use and transportation planning in those major urban areas to reduce greenhouse gases from the transportation sector. That's going to require a major rethinking of transportation and transportation planning, not just making sidewalks and bicycle lanes the thing you add on to a street expansion or a new roadway, but actually planning for people, not for cars. That is much easier said than done, and shifting that culture. So we've got a good structure in place. Whether we are able to live up to that structure remains to be seen. I think the Portland metropolitan region has done a lot more in that. They've adopted a climate smart strategy, integrating land use and transportation planning to reduce VMT, basically. We have the structure. Again, our state agency they don't control the funds over any of this, the land use agency, and local governments, I'm sure it's true everywhere, it's kind of a hodgepodge of who's paying for what. So the planning's there. You have to have the planning.
So we start with that. And, I just wrote a paper on land use and transportation policies intersecting to address climate change. So maybe Elena can put that in the chat in case you want a long treatment of that from an academic issue, an academic perspective. Jesse or John, did you have anything to add on the transportation planning piece?
Just one interesting thing as it relates to this MBTA communities law is that the law actually required the DHCD to write these draft guidelines in consultation with Massachusetts Department of Transportation and the MBTA, which was something I was excited about because generally housing and transportation agencies in Massachusetts don't have a whole lot to do with each other. I was hopeful that there would be more discussion around reuse of MBTA parking lots for housing, particularly in commuter rail areas. And also historically, when the T has done that, they've still reused their land for housing development. They've still required a 1-for-1 replacement of all parking. So I was hoping this would move in that direction of moving away from that and encouraging more reuse of MBTA land. It hasn't necessarily, but maybe there's still opportunity for us to explore there because the law as written does require more interagency communication. But we didn't do that well, I would say, at this point.
Great. Well, we just have a few minutes left, and I kind of wanted to use this time to give one last big picture inspirational inspiration from you guys to our advocates here in Connecticut. And I guess my last question would be for each of you to say, what do you think worked best in your state so far and why? Or if you don't feel like you've done enough, what is the next big thing that you think your state and ours and states around the country should really tackle when it comes to statewide zoning reform? So I don't know who wants to go first, but I would love the inspiration and just last marching orders from you guys. Any suggestions? And I should have given you this one in advance because I know you guys have 300 things that you're running through and thinking, okay, which one do I say first?
Well, I'm happy to go first. One thing, as I've alluded to throughout, is this is a work in progress. This MBTA communities upzoning rule, and there's already hiccups that we're experiencing, along the lines of, communities opting out of participating, even if it's technically a requirement. So we're going to, as Abundant Housing Massachusetts, continue to monitor compliance and explore continued legislative fixes to the program to actually require communities to participate and not give them the opportunity to opt out. So maybe that's not as big as you were thinking, Sarah, but that's, I think, in order to make this law effective, we have to make sure all impacted communities do participate.
We have by the way, I just got a direct message from somebody from your state saying 1 to 4 units plus ADUs by right on all residential lots. So very specific formula suggested there. Maybe you can take that up. All right, who wants to go next?
I can go next, and we actually have that in Portland, what you just described. But in any event, I think what the takeaways I have from here, from Oregon, is that we have the strength of a statewide, long in existence planning structure that is generally accepted. But the turn that I saw in the legislature and statewide that got us from ADUs to middle housing and will take us to the next step was really talking about this as housing for everyone. Everyone needs housing. These are not just affordable housing programs, as I think Jesse was mentioning was important in Massachusetts. This is housing for everyone in every neighborhood, and that everyone deserves a safe and affordable place to call home. And when we talked about it like that, and with some of the national conversations going on about the racially and economically exclusionary nature of our housing patterns, that really changed the conversation. We had bipartisan support, bipartisan leadership, and we needed it because we had bipartisan opposition. And it united groups from across the spectrum, from the home builders to the tenants' rights advocacy, everything in between, environmental transit advocates. And that broad coalition was necessary with deadlines for compliance for local governments. Local governments, as you all I'm sure know, often secretly enjoy having that state as a backdrop, that there's a deadline and there's going to be automatic codes going into place if there's a lack of compliance. What do we need to do next? We have more to do. Middle housing is not the answer alone for meeting the affordable housing and all housing needs of Oregonians. And we have some ideas for what is coming next or should come next. Thank you.
All right, Jon.
Yeah, in 10 seconds or less, I'll say that the thing I think worked best here in California was that people showed their legislators that it was safe to vote yes. People were afraid of the NIMBYs, the loud voices, the people who show up all the time, and there was no political counterweight. So, you know, as unsophisticated as it sounds, send the emails, make the calls, and just be present, because if your voice is not there, the other ones will definitely be there. I think the thing that works best in terms of getting things out of the ground is there is no money attached to this stuff. In California, the state famously said that no city or county must commit even a penny to all this work. It's only to develop the plans. It's only to plan ahead. And so in a big picture thing, I think tying infrastructure money, and, you know, whether it's roads, sewers, water, whatever it may be, tying those things to housing production so that if you're not doing the one, you don't get the other.
Excellent. All right, so we will take all of that to heart. I think we have one last slide to show you, which is our, first of all, to thank the speakers. I should say this has been a really great conversation, and I really enjoy hearing from other states. We can all learn from each other and help to build a pro-homes movement nationally. So our next conversation is going to be in a week from today. We have 4 really great speakers, one from AARP, one from our coalition member, the Connecticut Main Street Center, and the Safe Streets Coalition of New Haven. And moderating that panel will be one of our new legal fellows, Natalie Punzak. So with that, and there's a registration link in the chat. So with that, I will thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you next week. Catherine, you can stop the recording now, right? So thank